I've already started my journey looking at the evolution of the monster archetypes, right? I give this little intro every time I talk about it. But last year I did a really in-depth, in-depth as you can be for a YouTube video series, study on where those three main monster archetypes anyway came from: Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. We looked at the historical tensions behind, the original folk tales and everything. And then we looked up to the seminal literary works: Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. And then we talked a little bit about the impact from that point, staged adaptations, certainly the first great, Universal monster movies that were made. Then that was pretty much where we stopped. So for this year, I'm trying to go through and look at the evolution of those archetypes in popular culture since they first hit the silver screen, since those first classic, amazing, Universal monster movies, or, even the other companies, because Jekyll and Hyde wasn't a Universal monster movie, but that came out certainly and pushed us towards, the idea of Lon Chaney's Wolfman eventually. First Henry Hull's Werewolf in London, and then Lon Chaney's Wolfman. So we talked about that in previous videos this year. Thus far, I've covered the sequels to the Universal monster movies, right? I wanted to talk about those because those were really, people sleep on those, and I don't know why. They're nothing like the caliber that the first ones were, but they're still fun, especially when they get to weaving the stories together of the Universal monsters. And you've got the Wolfman, Frankenstein, and Dracula appearing in the same movies and whatnot. They're a lot of fun. So I mentioned that. I did a whole video on that. What marks the end of that sort of Universal original sort of golden age era for these archetypes really was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And I want to just say a few brief words about these Abbott and Costello movies. Because right now, today, at this point, I think everybody just dearly loves it. If you loved the Universal monster movies, you love Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, for the most part. Maybe some of you don't. It was really the first and most, just the classic, like the seminal horror comedy. Like, that's how you do it. It was really great. And just like the Universal monster movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, they saved Universal from going bankrupt that first time. Remember, Universal was in financial trouble. We were talking, especially after the Lon Chaney Sr. movies and everything, and the Depression had hit, and they were really in trouble. And those monster movies really saved them. A big deal. It was a big deal. Well, by the time that, the 40s have ebbed on, we're into the late 40s at this point, Universal became Universal International Pictures. And they ended up maybe having to go bankrupt again. They were in trouble again. This is, post-war World II. That's just been wrapping up now. And so they were in some trouble again. And then this movie called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein just rocked the world. It was wildly popular. And it's so important for a number of reasons. From the monster standpoint, it's incredibly important because it was the second and last time that Bela Lugosi would play the named character Dracula. And it was the last time you had a proper team up of these classic Universal monsters. Bela Lugosi as Dracula, Glenn Strange reprising the role of Frankenstein's monster, and Lon Chaney Jr. in his last film role as the Wolfman. There was a television, it was like a variety show, like a television show segment. I think it happened in the 60s, I think. Believe it or not, Boris Karloff actually put the Frankenstein makeup on, and Lon Chaney Jr. put the Wolfman makeup back on. It was for this little like television show segment or something. I forgot the name of it. I've got it written down somewhere. I'm still trying to hunt it down. But that was technically the last time, those guys ever put the makeup on or whatever. But this was the last film. And it's the last time these Universal monsters ever came together. And what a great time it is for them to come together. They're the real monsters in this movie. They're not suddenly clumsy and suddenly cracking jokes or anything. They are 100% their real monster selves. But you have Abbott and Costello in the mix and the story, which just makes they're hilarious. They're so funny. Now, they were already popular at this point. But Abbott and Lou Costello were already a team. They were already popular. They had technically done one film already called Hold That Ghost, or Hold the Ghost. I forget what the preposition there is, or article is. But it's actually really funny. I watched it, and I forget the woman's actress, but there's a woman actress in it who's a comedic character just as much as Abbott is. and the two of them together are hilarious. They have this whole dance scene, which is so funny. So Abbott and Costello Hold the Ghost, that's a hilarious movie. It's really fun, but technically it's not really a supernatural film because it's one of those where they're in the dark mansion, but there ends up being like mobsters behind the supernatural going ons, trying to scare them into this or that, to getting them the money and so forth, and that from the beginning going in. I'm not even spoiling anything in that. That's just kind of the setup of the whole movie. But it did allow them to start with some of these, comedic shticks, like where Abbott sees something and Costello doesn't, or excuse me, Costello sees something where Abbott doesn't. Like the candle, gag that they brought back in Frankenstein, or Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So that's a really great one. They had done that one. And Abbott and Costello had been toying with the idea. They really wanted to do something with the monsters. In fact, they were thinking about maybe doing like a Broadway show or a series, like a season of Broadway shows with these monsters or whatever. But they were so busy in film, it just never worked out. And then when somebody brought on the idea of doing the film, they were all for it. They didn't like the script, though. They really hated the script because the script is more of a story more than it relies just on their vaudeville sketches. And that's what a lot of their movies had done at that point. Hold the Ghost certainly does that. It's like, here's a little bit of narrative. Okay, now the narration is going to take a pause while they do this vaudeville sketch. Okay, and the narrative goes on. Now it's going to take a pause while they do this vaudeville sketch. It's kind of like some of the Saturday Night Live movies, which are great, right? But like Wayne's World 2 really started this, where it was just like the plot was just an excuse to get to the next sketch idea. And if you'd watched a lot of the old Wayne's World sketches, you could recognize them in the movie. They were just rehashing them, I think Coneheads might have done that to a certain degree too, and stuff like that. So that was kind of the deal of it, but they were popular, so whatever. But this movie was so unique in that it told a real story, a script, there's an actual story. And the Wolfman, Lawrence Talbot is, he's surviving. He's a wolf again. So forget the whole retcon, or they retconned the whole thing where he was cured at the end of House of Frankenstein or House of Dracula. But he's a werewolf, and they don't explain anything. He's just a werewolf, and he's been surviving by locking himself in hotel rooms, during the full moon, which is that really going to work? But whatever, you go with it. But he's been kind of on the trail of Dracula. He's found out that Dracula has plans to revive Frankenstein's monster. So he's on the trail of Dracula, sort of a vampire hunter, right? Because he knows the evil that Frankenstein's monster can create. He knows the evil that Dracula can create. So he's he's following them, and they ends up following them to the United States. I think is it Louisiana? It's somewhere down south, or Florida or something like that, because they have the outdoor and it's kind of that swampy with the Spanish moss and stuff in the trees and whatnot. So and then Abbott and Costello are these workers that are receiving, like package receiving place, who are responsible for unpacking the monsters in their crates, and it just really solid story. Jane Randolph is in it. She does a great job. It's really hilarious, and the movie really did kick off a whole little subgenre of these horror comedies with Abbott and Costello. The very next one, they had offered Boris Karloff the role of coming back as Frankenstein's monster, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. He didn't want to do it. There's speculation that maybe he thought they were going to like make the monster more of a joke, and they didn't. The monster is the monster that he's always been, at least in the last few movies. They didn't make him a joke, but he didn't want to do it. He marketed it for it a little bit, but after this movie came out and it was such a wild success, Boris Karloff was in the next one. They did Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, which didn't do quite as well because it doesn't have a big named monster. It had Boris Karloff, and he's more of like this sorcerer magician, like Eastern style magician or whatever. I haven't seen that one myself, but the clips of it look pretty interesting. Eventually, they moved on to do Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, Abbott and Costello Meet Jekyll and Hyde. That's the other one that I really like. I like them all, but Abbott and Costello Meet Jekyll and Hyde, that's Boris Karloff as well. And you have Boris Karloff playing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's a unique take on it because even Dr. Jekyll, he's already pretty vicious and mean and evil. He just lets Mr. Hyde do all of the actual evil. He plans it and then lets Mr. Hyde go kill this person or whatever. But Boris Karloff is great in the role. And that's another one where it follows more of a story than it does the actual, vaudeville shtick, sketches and whatnot. So that was great. And I think the last one they did was Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. I think that was the last one that they did. Um, let's see, Al should know. Al pop in for the trivia. Cheney Jr. and Karloff donned the makeup on Route 66. That was the name of the show I was talking about. The thing about these horror comedy movies is it does mark an important stage in our look at the evolution of these monster archetypes. Because at this point, you're talking late 40s. Okay, Dracula came out in 1930 or 31. I forget, I think 31. And that's when Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, all the movies came out there. And, Wolfman didn't come out until 41, I think. But this is, I think Abbott and Costello was 48 or something. It was solidly late 40s. So you had a lot of the adults going to see the movie had watched the Universal monster movies as children. So they would want to go back and see these characters, and then they would bring their kids because it's an Abbott and Costello film. So it's a fun movie. It's obviously a movie safe for kids. So they would bring their kid, and kids freaking loved this movie, Abbott and Costello Meet the Frankenstein. And I think it's, kids had always been, there's always an appeal of the Universal monsters to children because it is scary. It was scary to them, but there was also just all of that pathos. And you can really kind of break it down, even the three main archetypal monsters we've talked about. I mean, Dracula definitely has a kind of sexual awakening appeal. You can imagine children pre-puberty or close to it, and there's an appeal there. You can get that with the biting of the neck. We've gone into that more deeply in last year's videos. Frankenstein and Wolfman to a certain extent. Think about the Wolfman, his body is changing, right? You go through puberty, your body's changing. And Frankenstein is a misfit. He's misunderstood. People don't understand him. He's the monster anyway. He's also got body parts that aren't even his own, and it's there's a great song, one of the classic Alice Cooper songs I love from the 80s called Teenage Frankenstein. And it's a great song. Anytime Alice Cooper does a song about Frankenstein, it's going to be a hit. It's great. Feed My Frankenstein, Teenage Frankenstein. He had one called White Light Frankenstein, I think, on his last album. But anyway, Teenage Frankenstein, the lyrics go, I'm a teenage Frankenstein. These ain't my arms and these legs ain't mine. And, it's on the one hand, you can read it as sort of a literal narrative of sort of a teenage monster movie, like I was a teenage Frankenstein. But on the other hand, too, it's like, I remember once you start growing up and you're, a lot of, especially boys, will get a little clumsy around puberty, like when their body starts to develop and suddenly like they'll hit a growth spurt and their joints aren't fully, accounted for, all the extra height or weight or whatever, I mean, people can get a little clumsy and it's like out of these, it's happens, so you can see that appeal a little bit too. I mean, you can go a lot more deeply into it, but there's always been that appeal of children to these Universal monster, the classic archetypes. And by the time Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, or excuse me, by the time Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein happen, it just really solidified that big time. Now, the other thing it did a little bit, and which you'll hear people talk about, not so much anymore, unless it's like in the terms of a history, is that it did make the monsters more of a kiddie kind of thing for a while, not really so much the classic Universal monsters aren't really scary so much anymore. And like, let's go see a proper horror film the way it was in 1931. It was a little more, they were for kids stuff kind of thing. Still fun, but they were light. It was kind of they were a silly kind of thing. And that's unfortunate, but it's also temporary and necessary, I think, in the evolution of an archetype. And the example I'll give you is Batman. If you can find, they're older now, but if you can find people who were big Batman comic book fans at the time when Adam West's Batman came out on TV, they usually do not like that series at all. Like, go look up Michael Uslan, the guy who kind of saved Batman for the film. I'm so mad they're making fun of my hero. They just made him a big joke. And yeah, I can see that. I can see being upset about that if that's where you were at the time. In hindsight now, though, we know that Batman 66 wasn't so much trying to poke fun at the character. It was just trying to be a theater of the absurd, which is a legit genre. And it was necessary to keep the character popular because the Batman comics were really, Batman was a bit in danger of cancellation, comic book wise at the time, but it surged in popularity. Yes, there is an unfortunate couple of decades we had there where your average Joe Blow on the street thought that Batman was just kid stuff. Michael Uslan was trying to get people to make a Batman movie. He was like, I'm telling you guys, this is going to be immensely popular and successful. And all the companies were like, no, that's kid stuff. That's kid stuff. Finally he found the producers to work with him for Batman. They got Tim Burton on board and everything. And then boom, Batmania happened. But believe it or not, now it's just like, if you make a Batman movie, it's gonna make money. But at a time, people were like, oh no, we're not touching Batman with a 10-foot pole. That's so silly. But it was still, it had to happen to keep Batman alive and to keep, and how many fans today who are a bit older than me, grew up watching that show, loving it dearly as kids. I came to the show Batman 66 when Batmania was happening in 89, right? I was like 8 or 9 years old, just getting into comic books and the character of Batman myself. So I was going to eat up anything with Batman on it. Yeah, heck, I watched the Batman 66, loved it. I thought it was great. And in my mind, it was never like at odds with Batman 89, right? They were just two different versions of the same thing. I was okay with the different genres, but that's just an example. So that did happen somewhat to the Universal monsters, where Dracula was, because Bela Lugosi really, as per the director's orders, I'm sure it's a comedy film, he had to really over exaggerate his mannerisms. So in this movie is where you see him hold his cape up over his nose, and it's a movement that he has to do because then Costello, does that too, and it's very funny. He's like, Abbot, or Chick, as he calls him. He's like, oh, what and then he also did that double jointed hand thing a lot, as he's trying to hypnotize and so forth. And it was, it's just a great film. It's also the first instance that I can track down. If you guys know of something before this, let me know. But it's the first instance in a movie that I can track down where Dracula is invested in Frankenstein's monster. Dracula has plans for the creature some which way. That's the first instance of it that I've found, because we've seen it since then. I mean, certainly Monster Squad, or a lot of different movies. Dracula is somehow engaged or wants to do something with the monster. The monster calls him master. That wasn't the case for the previous movies. In fact, in both House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, the two team-up movies in which both of those characters are in there, they never even acknowledge each other. Like, the plot just kind of keeps them separate too. Like, there's just the Wolfman's the one who's dealing with Dracula and dealing with Frankenstein's monster. Dracula and Frankenstein are just sort of like completely, aside from each other. So Frankenstein, or Abbott Costello Meet Frankenstein, wasn't really the start of which is a wonderful idea, I think. Dracula kind of sort of being a mastermind in terms of a monster verse, where he has plans for Frankenstein's monster in some which way. It was a plot point in Van Helsing, because it was looking back at all of this stuff that had gone beforehand. Monster Squad was the same way, looking back at the classic Universal monsters in that last team up, which was Abbott Costello Meet Frankenstein. So yeah, I think I've got, was there a super chat that I missed here? Oh yeah, a couple super chats here. Let me double check. But yeah, so if you like horror comedies, if you like the idea of it, I really recommend, first, you just got to watch Abbott Costello Meet Frankenstein. If you've never seen it, it was the first monster movie I'd ever seen as a kid. It was the first time I was introduced to these classic versions of Dracula. I remember it was on TV, and it was fine. I could watch it. I was a kid. And I don't remember how old I was, but I was cracking up. I thought it was really funny, Costello's, fear and everything. And when they're unboxing Dracula there and the candle on the thing, it was hilarious, but it was also scary too. I was like, look out, Dracula's behind you, So I remember I had that experience as a kid, and it was great. And it was my first experience too, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, or the classic Frankenstein or Wolfman. So then when I went on to later to watch the classics, loved it. Absolutely loved it.